I'm going to read from Swamiji's commentary on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, weekly commentaries, and we are up to week number 8. And the title of this commentary is, Can Man See God? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Excuse me. There is a saying in chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John that would seem to respond to this question with a definite no. Can man see God? The saying is, no man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. Many great saints, however, claim to have met God. If we ask then, can God be seen, rather than can man see God, the answer is yes, else those saints lied, and the scriptures themselves lied. For Jesus also said, Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The point is, it is not man, this human body, these human eyes that sees God. God can be seen only with spiritual vision, with the eye of the soul. As the Bhagavad Gita puts it in the 11th chapter, Thou canst not see me with mortal eyes, therefore I now give thee sight divine. Behold my supreme power of yoga. With these words, Hari, the exalted Lord of yoga, revealed himself to Arjuna in his infinite form. Paramhansa Yogananda, in Autobiography of a Yogi, describes the supernal experience in words more readily comprehensible to modern minds than the poetic phraseology of the Gita. The chapter, An Experience in Cosmic Consciousness, is one of the most inspiringly beautiful in all mystical literature. Here is a brief excerpt. An oceanic joy broke upon calm, endless shores of my soul. The Spirit of God, I realized, is exhaustless bliss. His body is countless tissues of light. I saw the divine dispersion of rays pour from an eternal source, blazing into galaxies, transfigured into ineffable auras. Again and again, I saw the creative beams condense into constellations, then resolve into sheets of transparent flame. By rhythmic reversion, sextillion worlds passed into diaphanous luster. Fire became firmament. I cognized the center of the Empyrean as a point of intuitive perception in my heart. Irradiating splendor issued from my nucleus to every part of the universal structure. The creative voice of God I heard resounding as Om, the vibration of the Cosmic Mother. This, so the great masters aver, is what God is, and this also, they insist, is what we are in our deepest reality. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. This is one of the deeper and extremely interesting commentaries in this book. I took it because it was sequential. I considered briefly last night choosing something easier, but decided I would say it anyway. In the course of last evening, when most of you were present, toward the end of the evening, I was asked a very serious question, which I think it was a little too late for me to give it the full energy, so I want to go back to it here. It wasn't Sanchita's question about ego, but an earlier question about how, in the face of so much suffering, in this world, and so much suffering that each of us individually ends up enduring, can we still have an experience of joy? And this is what all the masters tell us, and this is what the masters express. I often think that the joy, for example, that we saw manifested through Swami Kriyananda, and that he tells us was the signature state of consciousness of Master, was bliss. And if anyone could see the suffering of the world more deeply, it would be a Master whose consciousness was not only omnipresent in his own physical body and all that touched upon that, but who, like Lahiri Mahashaya, could exclaim, "I'm drowning off the coast of Japan," he says, and the next day they find out a ship has gone down. And he actually felt the death throes of all those people. There's a story of Ramakrishna, and one of his disciples, who was a cook in the kitchen, was annoyed by a cat and hit the cat with a stick to get him to leave the kitchen. And then when he went into where Ramakrishna was sitting, Ramakrishna had welts on his back. And the disciple became irate on behalf of his guru. "Who could have possibly done this to you?" And then, "Let me get my hands on him," was the implication. And Ramakrishna said to his disciple, "Well, it was you who did it. When you beat that cat, the very blows to that cat's body went onto my own body." Master said at the end of his life, Swamiji talks about walking around with him, and Master sort of stumbling and not being able to keep going. And Master explained his unsteadiness by saying, "I am in so many bodies, sometimes I forget which one I'm supposed to keep going." On another occasion he said, "I have to ask people whether I've eaten or not." I mean, all of these examples are given to us not to emphasize our inadequacy in terms of our own potential, but really to just open our eyes to who we are and where we're going. Sometimes people ask me, excuse me just a minute. Sometimes people ask me how can they explain or persuade these teachings, to their relatives or to their friends at work or people who just aren't willing to accept it. The Gita tells us, and Jesus said it more humorously, Jesus used the phrase, "Cast not your pearls before swine," is how he put it, referring to the spiritually uninterested as swine, which was not very kind, but nonetheless, he wanted to make the point really clear. Jesus didn't bother with half statements. He was very firm about what he was saying. That there is this certain point that comes in our soul evolution where something somehow shifts for us. And it's very, very difficult to quantify exactly when that happens. In our temple in Palo Alto, we have a very wide and varied congregation. And sometimes we have tried to do marketing research to try to figure out to whom we should advertise, to whom we should announce our activities in order to get the right people. We have been unable to quantify it in any way that, conventional marketing would tell you to quantify it. Because the only unifying factor is that somehow, somewhere along the line, somehow, somewhere along the line, a person has figured out that there are two realities going on. There is the external reality in which we are so self-evidently engaged. Every individual person from babyhood just begins to get engaged in this world. I've shared with you when I witnessed the birth of the baby of a friend of mine. I've never had children of my own, so I haven't actually seen it myself. But this baby was just minutes old, and already her eyes were open and she was reaching. She was reaching for everything she could reach for, and the closest thing was her father's hand, which of course was exquisite to see. The little tiny hand. He was a big man too, so he had a great big hand in her little tiny hand. And on one side of it, it was just so touching to sort of see the relationship beginning and, imagine all that was going to happen over the course of this girl's and this man's lifetime. On the other hand, it was appalling to realize from a spiritual point of view how very quickly, even from the first minutes of birth, our energy moves from an inward to an outward focus. And then for the rest of our lives, most people, without any thought at all, are just reaching. American supermarkets put a lot of things that interest children on a very low level close to the floor. You get to the checkout stands in a supermarket, and I noticed once there's all this candy that's just right at floor level. And my first thought was, that's a pretty goofy place to put it. And then I saw all the toddlers coming and reaching for it. Mommy, 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 and this incredible fight going on between the parents and the children when their fists are full of candy. The marketing people there know exactly who their target audience is and how to make it work, because the children are just reaching like this. Now, compared to the saints, all of us are children, and they watch us, and we reach for fame, and we reach for money, and we reach for human love, and we reach for the satisfaction of having the people around us achieve things, and all of those different realities. And the saints just sort of sit there and calmly wait for us. Their reality being so different. It's like if you've ever been up in an airplane or on the top of a tall building and you look down and everything is so changed from that perspective. You try to figure out, where your house is, or, oh, look at that teeny little thing and that's a car, like that. And it's exactly that perspective. These things loom so large to us, but in fact, in the greater reality, they're so different. It's the idea of a piece of cloth being woven out of many individual threads. I have to just get this open. Being woven of many individual threads. It's a very valid and interesting image for the way that the individual soul lives in this world and the way the world itself actually works. I was talking to Jamal, and he gave me, I'm always being asked the question about free will, about how much free will do we have in this world, and I become very impatient a lot of times. I become bored with answering that question. And Jamal and I were having a discussion because I find it a very hard question to answer, so I think I get annoyed because I can't answer it as part of the reason. But he had a very interesting point of view on it, which I think also relates to this question of joy, which is if you think of a woven tapestry. I remember going to Kashmir many years ago and going into the carpet factories. And I'm sure many of you have seen, they would have the big pattern on this piece of this cardboard book, sort of. I mean, it was completely incomprehensible, but they all understood it. And everybody's weaving on this carpet. The threads are going through like this and gradually just sort of emerging here as this pattern. And when you see the pattern finished, it's just extraordinary. But somebody knew exactly where to put every thread and how to put it so that it would come out exactly like that. Our individual lives are very much like that. We are part of a pattern, and that pattern has been established by the commitments of our own energy. And our sense of free will is that somehow we imagine that we can take our little thread and pull it out of the carpet, or we can sort of run with it and just run over to this side of the room and tie a little bow with it or something like that, not understanding that it's all part of this pattern that we're involved in. But the question is not so much where is that thread going and how is it being woven. The question really is, how are we perceiving the experience of that thread? How are we defining ourselves? What are we identifying with? It's very true that when we're right in that little thread, you really can't see anything at all. You can see the threads on either side of you. Maybe you can see an inch ahead. Maybe you can reach back an arm's length and sort of feel what's behind you. There is a helpless sense of entrapment in a very real sense. And when I think back upon the discontent of my early years in my life, I didn't really have the right words for it. But when I began to understand the confining reality of being identified with one physical body in one incarnation, in one circumstance, compared to the infinity, which is our true nature. I began to realize that that was the confinement I was feeling. My first impulse to break that confinement as a teenage girl was that I would get married and I would have 12 children. Because then there would be 14 of us, right? Which compared to one seemed like a large number. But at a certain point, I could perceive that even many children, and all of their children, and all of their children, that we were still identified and confined from that first point of these are my children, these are my grandchildren, these are my great-grandchildren, whatever it is. But the essential point of confinement, which is being identified and living in this one body, it would not be broken. And in fact, I remember a existential crisis, I guess you would call it. And in my memory, I was awake all night, lying awake in my bed, thinking about this. Probably I wasn't awake all night, but that's how it felt to me. And in my imagination, I tried to conceive of some situation that would be different than that. But of course, even in my imagination, everywhere I went, I took myself with me. I imagined space travel, I imagined other planets, I imagined times in the past, I imagined times in the future. And I was also very conscious in that same experiment of the fact that no matter what I did in my life, no matter how adventurous, no matter how marvelous and fulfilling, no matter what, there would be a moment. And at that time I had never seen anybody die, but I could imagine it. There would be a moment when I would be somewhere and my soul would leave my body. And there would be a last breath. And there was a realization in that last breath that none of it would matter. It's fascinating to contemplate how completely we're gone when we're gone. You know, you could die on a battlefield, you could die in a prisoner camp, you could die as a king, you could die as the President of the United States or the President of India, any of those things. The moment the soul separates from the body, all of that is related to the body you're in, and it just goes away completely. It's a marvelous meditation to think about everything that you're attached to, everything that you're defined, and in a moment that will come, and when it comes, it will be the only moment there is. It will just all dissolve, just like that. Now, we live many incarnations, and we forget these things. Jyotish and Devi tell this really funny story about the birth of their son. They had one son, and when Devi was in the throes of labor, giving birth to that child, they were actually closer to the birth of the baby than they realized, and she entered that period where sometimes a woman becomes a little nervous. Jyotish, being so philosophical, he said to Devi, "Oh, Devi," he said, "there's no reason to be concerned. You've probably given birth over your incarnations to enough babies to populate the city of Sacramento." And even at the time, Devi thought, why didn't he say Paris or Rishikesh or somewhere like that? Sacramento is not a very glamorous city, even in California. Even San Francisco has the Golden Gate Bridge. He said Sacramento. And she had this sudden picture. There's a chain of coffee shops in America called Denny's, which is a very just plain place where just, the most ordinary people go in and out. There's nothing glamorous about Denny's. Nobody goes to glamour to see and be seen to Denny's. I mean, you just go if you need a cup of coffee late at night. So she said she had this picture of all these people walking in and out of Denny's in Sacramento, and they were all babies she'd given birth to at one time or another, like that. And then, of course, she passed through the moment and their beautiful son was born. But it's a very valid thought, isn't it? And when the masters look at us and we are just like knotted up over, this thing that's happening to me right now. I've seen Swamiji, this poor woman came to him with this story of whatever her tale of woe was, which was not insignificant. He said, well, now that you're a disciple and a devotee, at least you know that there's a purpose to all of this, don't you? And she said, you know, this. That was basically her response. And so he said it again very gently. And then she once again repeated all the difficulty she was going through, at which point Swami just smiled. You know, she was determined, even in the presence of such a great soul, who was saying, the thread is going to follow the pattern. You know, the karma is set in motion, and the thread is going to follow the pattern. So even I, Swami Kriyananda in that case, I can't tell you that the pattern is going to change, but I can tell you that you can raise your level of perception, and then you will see that the pattern is very different. And you will also see that in the end, this beautiful picture will be painted. And every picture has places of shadow where if you look right up at them, you think, oh, look, this painting is nothing but a black spot. And you get very upset because you're traveling through the black spot. But when you stand back, you know, I was looking at the photograph of Master or the picture here, you know, you could concentrate on a corner of his hair. You could just walk right up and put your eyes right against the corner of his hair, and then someone would ask you, what does Master's picture look like? Just black. You know, it's just black shadow, there's nothing in it. What is the nature of your life? Oh, it's just black shadow, there's nothing in it. And so, to go back to our scripture reading today, then we declare, there's no purpose to life, it's just suffering, there's no reason to be joyful. And we don't understand what the masters realize, which is just standing above it and seeing it from a different level. Or another way of putting it, this is virtually my earliest memory as a child, and some of you have heard me. Now that there's the internet, you know, everybody in the world knows the same stories. I used to be able to tell jokes and no one had heard them. But now it's not like that. But there is a story of myself when my mother scolded me when I was about 2. And I was very hurt. I had been naughty. It wasn't like I felt I was being mistreated. It was my brother's fault, of course. My brother was a terrible tease, and we were always getting in trouble, and then he was always looking innocent. But in any case, I didn't like the feeling. I mean, just like we're not different. Swamiji put it so well. He said, children lack experience and language, but their full intelligence and their full state of realization is present from infancy. I mean, where would it go? You know, the soul comes in, the soul brings its whole reality. The destiny of the adult is right there. It's just the child hasn't yet learned how to express it. It has a little bit of freedom, really, from all of that burden for a while. It gets to play. As Swamiji said, you see children playing at being children. They get to have the fun of being children. And most interestingly, if those of you who come to see the movie this afternoon, maybe you've seen it already, but there's a scene right at the beginning when Juliet is talking in the movie. They're just describing Swami Kriyananda's early life. And they illustrate it with some home movies that his father took. And there's Swami Kriyananda's riding a little bicycle. He was maybe 6. That's what he looks like. And just as a child, he drives his bike right up to his father, and the camera comes right like this. And his face, he's 6. He has exactly the same face on. I mean, it's just the same face that he died with. Just this beautiful, joyful, free expression, and even just everything about that face, it's exactly the same face. And in fact, that's become my favorite image of Swamiji. And when I look at it, I don't see a child at all. I just see that freedom, that joyous freedom of consciousness that often little children have. But in my experience as a little one myself, I didn't like suffering. That's been my intense theme. I just don't like suffering. Some people seem to enjoy it more than I do. I have this terrible impatience with being unhappy. I just can't stand it. It's an interesting fact how our characters are molded. That's just a by the way. I have a very good friend, a deeply spiritual person, serious meditator, just a really good soul. And she has a tremendous amount of endurance. Her attitude towards circumstances in her life is to endure them. And she has a lot of strength in that endurance. My attitude toward life is to find a creative solution to change them. And I have learned endurance later in my life, but also I have become very creative because I have a very low tolerance for suffering. And so as soon as I find myself in it, I'm determined to create an alternative to it. Not a falsehood, but a true alternative to it. So as a little child, my mother scolded me and I didn't like it. It was just that feeling in my heart. And I remember curling up on the floor of the car, listening to the sound of the tires, which is a om sound, really. Just tuning into that steady sound and consciously thinking, I have another place deep within me, and that's how I considered it. I kept going deeper and deeper into myself until I found the place where the suffering no longer existed. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, and it was just like, that's how I already knew. That's how you deal with it. When difficulties come, you can say, you expand your awareness until you're just looking down on your little life, or you go deep within yourself till you find the point before you identified with this body, before someone could hurt you, and you just find that unchanging inner reality. You know, this is the solution to everything. There is no other solution. Everything else is just a stopgap measure. A friend of mine found herself intensely emotionally upset because of the actions of another person, which had had a very painful effect on her life. And she was trying hard to overcome this pain. She didn't want to have to live with it. And she came to Swamiji and she announced, I feel much better because I've decided that everything was perfect. Everything just happened exactly the way it was. Everybody did just what they were supposed to do. Swami looked at her and he said, no, they didn't. Just like that. He said, that person, and he named the person, behaved very badly. Just like that. And then he said, don't try to comfort yourself by telling yourself a lie. You know, don't try to make a fairy tale out of things. You have to be able to look right at it, see it for what it is, he said, and then expand your consciousness from there. You know, because there is evil and error in this world. It's just a fact. And you will make serious mistakes. People around you will make serious mistakes. Occasionally, the dark force will begin to play in your life for reasons that, well, you actually consider it a compliment. I remember when Peter Caddy, who was the founder of the Findhorn community in Scotland, he was visiting Swami Kriyananda, and it was a period of time in which our neighbors were annoyed with us, and there was this battle going on, which I've described in other talks in India, where they kept knocking down our mailbox. And because they wanted to live quiet and alone and forgotten by society, we were advertising all over the world, and so we were a bit in conflict. And so they had knocked down our mailbox, and I mentioned to Swami that they'd knocked down our mailbox. And much more seriously, in the Findhorn community, they had built a beautiful temple, and somebody set it on fire and deliberately destroyed it, and much worse than a mailbox. But the two founders of these two communities, at that time, two of the most prominent ones, Peter said, well, that's good. He said, whenever you put out a lot of light, somebody tries to snuff the light out. If nobody's attacking you, you're not putting out enough light. And so he said, you need to be doing more good work, or else nothing will be challenging you. Now that's kind of a, and then they both laughed, the two of them just laughed so merrily about it. Another moment I saw like that, this is slightly off the subject, but not too far. Swami Chidananda, who was the president of the Divine Life Society, Swami Shivananda in Rishikesh. Chidananda and Kriyananda had known each other in 1960, 1961. On another occasion, Chidananda had come to America and visited Ananda. And then in the 90s, maybe about 1993 or 95, we were in India, and Chidananda was still alive, of course, at that time. And a group of us went with Swami Kriyananda to visit Swami Chidananda at his ashram in Rishikesh. Some of Chidananda's disciples had the idea that this would be a private meeting, but we would have none of it. We followed the wonderful Indian method and just crowded right in, and we're there. The two men didn't mind at all. They were sitting together like this. And Chidananda says to Swami Kriyananda, "And how is Ananda village?" And Swami Kriyananda says, "Fine," like that. And then Swami Kriyananda, with this glimmer in his eye, turns to Swami Chidananda and says, "And how is the Divine Life Society?" And Chidananda says, "Fine," like that. And then the two men together went, just this laugh that just was so lighthearted. And I talked to Kriyananda later, and this is exactly what it was. It was like, "And how is your famous life work?" "Oh, it's just fine." "And how is your famous life work?" "Oh, it's just fine." Then the two of them looked at each other and just laughed at the whole thing, and all the disciples are sitting like this. And the two men were just like, what does any of this matter? And that feeling just rolled over all of us. Both of them were heirs to enormous responsibility for their guru's work. Both of them had carried out in an exemplary manner the responsibility that had been given them by their masters. And both of them knew that the only thing that really matters is who they had become from that experience. And they were looking into each other's eyes, and they were seeing the same sort of joy of God, joy of discipleship, and then just like that. It was sort of like the whole room is just like wondering what on earth is happening, but you could just feel that freedom, that freedom. And believe me, both men, I certainly witnessed Swami Kriyananda and only know a little about Chidananda, worked every day to the limit of their capacity and suffered enormously from attacks from the dark force. In fact, right in that time, Swamiji was being persecuted by his own Guru Bhais, just right in the middle of all of that. But that's the pattern that has to be woven. That's the little thread, and as long as we live there, and this is what our scripture reading says, that little thread cannot in itself, just right here in this, experience the divinity of the Leela that we're engaged in. We have to step back a little bit, step inward a little bit, just always holding ourselves. Remember, there's a story, it's just an allegory, I think, but it's so, just a story, an allegory, about a man whose only son is bitten by a snake, by a cobra, and dies. And his wife comes to him and says, our only son has been killed by a snake. And he's very calm about it. And his wife becomes irate with him. "How can you be so calm? I've just told you our son has died." And the man answers, he said, "Well, I had a dream last night that I had 7 sons. And all 7 sons were bitten by cobras, and all 7 sons died." He said, "And I can't tell right now whether I should mourn for those 7 sons or for this one." And, on one hand, part of the heart says, but you must. And as I was saying last night when someone was asking me about Swami Kriyananda's feeling nature, it's not that you don't feel it. It's not that you don't make the pattern. The rug, every thread has to make the pattern. You can't just sort of stick a purple thread in there when the pattern calls for other nuances of color. You have to make the pattern the way destiny is going to have you make it. But how you relate to it, you see, that's our freedom. How do we relate to it? Do I lock myself and take away all my own freedom by allowing my happiness, my state of mind, my joy, to be completely conditioned by where this little thread is going next? Or do I recognize that there's a whole pattern and I can watch the thread and experience its reality, but always knowing that there's a part of myself that's completely different? I had a dream once. I don't have many really interesting dreams, but this was one of them. I like to think it was super conscious. I was being executed, and I was being executed with a big axe, like those big battle axes, like the joke that's sort of curved with that funny blade like that, just like a cartoon character would hold one. And I was being executed by a man who's a very good friend of mine, very dear acquaintance, dear relationship. And there was just a big chopping block, and there was just the two of us, and he had this big axe. And it was, understood between us that it was just his responsibility to cut off my head. And I was perfectly fine with that. I recognized that it was something that he had to do. And so we chatted for a few minutes about the necessity of doing this. Then I put my head on the chopping block, and he lifted up the axe like this. He was a big man. He lifted up the axe like this. It's beginning to come down. I'm perfectly relaxed, but just as it begins to come down, it crosses my mind that this might hurt when he cuts my head off. And at the same time that concern enters my mind, I remembered that Master said, when the soul knows the body is about to get smashed to bits and not be useful anymore, the soul will exit just prior. That's why many people who are in automobile accidents or have a death in return, they'll see it coming and then they'll be above it. And of course, if the soul dies, if the body dies, then it goes away. If it's only an accident, it'll come back after a bit. So just at that moment, just as the axe was coming down, I remembered that I could leave. So I exited. And all of a sudden I start going up, and I see my body and the axe and my friend are still down there. And I'm just shooting up, just like the stories tell you. And I see that we're just sort of alone on this huge plain. There's nothing else but just the two of us. And this is the part I have to admit I'm most proud of. I looked down and I saw myself and I said, "Bye-bye, Asha." It was just like, done. And I was so just pleased when I woke up. I thought, isn't that great? At the moment it's over, it's just over. It's like we've done it as well as we can. The hard parts and the happy parts, we've given it our heart. We haven't been afraid. We've trusted God behind everything. And then when it's over, it's over. When it's over, meaning a happy little phase is over. When it's over because the whole incarnation is over. When it's over because beautiful relationships are over. Just over. Bye-bye. And we just stand back a little bit and watch the whole pattern. And don't put our face right up against Master's hair and call the world black. Yes, it's black. There is blackness in that painting. This is a painting of a God-realized Master, and from a certain perspective, it's only black. This is a painting of a soul soon to be freed. And from a certain perspective, it is black. But why would we want to live there? Why would we not train ourselves every day to find that point that is completely independent of all of this? This is where God exists. And this, the Masters promise us, is our destiny and our only reality.